Hello, I'm Bret Moss, and you're watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. Our guest today is Dr. David Gruder. Dr. David Gruder is the award-winning author of The New IQ, How Integrity Intelligence Serves You, Your Relationships, and the World. Dr. Gruder is a licensed clinical psychologist and co-founder of the Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology. Among his academic degrees, he has a doctorate from the California School of Professional Psychology at San Diego. David and his wife Lori live in San Diego, California. Dr. David Gruder, welcome to The Defining Moment. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome you here to our studio today.
Thanks, Bret. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thanks for coming. Our topic today is integrity, the foundation for living a life that you love. And I'd like to begin by inviting you to share a defining moment from your life.
Well, there are quite a number of defining moments, but the defining moment I want to share with you is actually a moment that was the genesis of a lot of my integrity material. This goes back 40 years now. I was in high school at the time, and my primary passion, my primary focus was music and drama, and my parents were very kind about shipping me off in the summertime to a camp for the performing arts in the Berkshires of Massachusetts, in the forests, the mountains there. And this one summer, before the summer began, the camp director sent out a note to all of the parents. And the note was, we're going to have an optional field trip this summer for the first time, and tell me whether or not you want your child to participate in this optional field trip. It's going to be to a music and arts festival in upstate New York. So my parents look at me naively and say, well, what do you think? And I look back at them equally naively and I say, well, I don't know. Sure, sounds good. Why not? What my parents didn't know that they were sending me off to was Woodstock, the infamous Woodstock Music and Arts Festival in 1969 in upstate New York. If my father, who was a very traditional man, could have helicoptered in to pick me up and pull me out of there, he would have. But he was stuck at home watching on TV as he realized with horror that he had sent his son to this infamous event that was getting world coverage. And I had gone there for the music, because music was my passion. Yes. But my experience there defies the stereotypes about Woodstock. I was 15 years old at the time. I was a drug-free virgin. That's how I arrived there. That's how I left there. The music was amazing. It was over-the-top amazing. But that's not what was the most amazing experience for me in Woodstock. Being at the Woodstock Music and Arts Festival in 1969 opened my eyes far beyond music, because what I experienced there was people who had gathered together because they felt passionate about exploring and discovering who they were as authentic people in contrast to the conformity of the 1950s. And they were also there because they were exploring new ways of understanding heart-based love in contrast to the traditional obligation-based and financial-based ways of being in marriage and in relationships. And they were also there because they were passionate about making a positive difference in the world and daring to believe that as citizens they could have more impact in society than had been believed up until that point in time. It took me decades to finally find words to articulate what I experienced there, but that experience was a defining moment for me in expanding my vision from my orientation in music and drama into a much larger vision that was embodied by the 500,000 people that I was there with.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. What is integrity?
Well, you know, Bret, that's a great question, because integrity has been one of those vague, abstract, philosophical concepts that almost everyone can agree, hey, that's a really important thing to have, and that's a really important thing to be. But when I ask people to define integrity for me, what they are usually able to do is describe one aspect or two aspects of integrity rather than the full picture of integrity.
Yes.
So part of integrity, of course, is about being a person whose actions and matches are intentions, where our commitments and our actions match. And part of integrity is about being who we really are. And part of integrity is about looking out for other people, looking out for the world around us, and not living as though we're isolated bubbles that have no interconnection with the world around us. That then led me to understand integrity in a much broader way than the dictionary definition of integrity, which is about being whole and complete and living life according to a certain set of guidelines, because that definition from the dictionary, it leaves a lot to be discovered or interpreted, like what does whole and complete really mean, and whose ethical guidelines are we talking about?
Yes.
Well, on a practical level, integrity means living at the intersection of me, we, and us all. It means giving equal attention to being in integrity with myself, being in integrity in the relationships that I have, and being in integrity with society.
Fascinating. Okay, thank you so much. Tell us about the 3 innate motivations or core drives which allow a human being to experience integrity-centered fulfillment.
What I've spent a lot of my career as a psychologist doing, both with clients when I was in private practice and also with the business and leadership consulting and mentoring that I've done, is I've been very curious about why certain people who come from very, very disrupted and trauma-based backgrounds end up living lives that are very, very fulfilling. Whereas some people who come from very ordinary garden variety backgrounds don't attain life fulfillment no matter what they try.
Okay.
And what I've found over the years of studying this question, which started all the way back in the early 1980s with my doctoral dissertation, was that there are 2 groups of us: natural developers and deliberate developers.
Okay.
And I'm a deliberate developer. I'm the second category. But natural developers are people who intuitively attain what I refer to as integrity-centered life fulfillment.
Okay.
And deliberate developers are the rest of us, like me, who don't necessarily know how to get there intuitively. And so what I started looking at was the question of, what do natural developers intuitively do? And do they have some things in common with each other? Is there a kind of a trend? Are there common traits and qualities?
Okay.
And if there are, which there turned out to be, can those be translated into specific skills that, if the rest of us learn those specific skills, we can attain on purpose what natural developers attain intuitively?
Okay, good.
And I found that, in fact, that can be done. Well, one of the things that I found was that natural developers live at the intersection of 3 core motivations, or what I call in the new IQ, 3 core drives.
Yes.
And I call them core drives because they are innate. And I'll explain that in a moment, but let me say what they are first.
Okay.
The first core drive is our drive to be who we truly are. That's our drive for authenticity.
Okay.
The second core drive is our drive to bond with others, and that's our drive for connection. And our third core drive is our drive to influence the world around us, and that's our drive for impact.
Okay.
Anyone who's a parent or who has been around children a lot sees these 3 core drives in the youngest of children. They see authenticity at work in infants.
Yes.
A child, the parent's worst nightmare in the authenticity department is that what parents most want is that when the child says their first word, that it'll be mommy or daddy.
Yes.
And too often they're very horrified and disappointed when the child's first word is no. And that's a child's initial forays into authenticity. Where do I end and the world begin? What fits for me and what doesn't fit for me? That's our authenticity core drive. Our connection core drive, well, we know indisputably from lots of research that if children are not sufficiently bonded with, they literally die. And if they don't literally die from touch and hug deprivation as infants, they become profoundly emotionally scarred. They die psychologically and or spiritually.
Emotionally?
They withdraw from being connected to their own emotional life, their own creativity, and their own capacity to have heart connections with other people. And so that need for hugs, that need for connection, in fact, you know what? There's only one thing that feels like love to a child, even though there are many loving things to offer a child, like food and clothing and shelter and medical care and all of those things. But the one thing that feels like love to a child is connection. And the third core drive, our drive for impact, well, we see that in the youngest of children too. It's their curiosity, where they start manipulating the world and getting into stuff that they shouldn't get into because they really want to discover what kind of impact they have on the world around them. So these are core motivations, and they don't go away as we grow older. We develop some kind of relationship with them. We either develop a muted relationship with one or more of these core drives, we push them away, or we over rely on one of these core drives because of pushing others away, or we may be blessed with developing a really balanced and full relationship with all three of those core drives. But these are our three core motivations: authenticity, connection, and impact.
Okay, thank you so much. So let's go ahead and look at each one of those in depth. So tell us a little bit more about how we can go about restoring integrity to the core drive of authenticity, or what you refer to as integrity at the level of self.
Exactly. Well, Bret, this is one of the things that's very important about the connection between life fulfillment and integrity. We've pursued in our culture, if I can digress
Please
just
go
briefly,
right ahead.
We've pursued in our culture a faulty formula for life fulfillment. That formula has been wealth plus lifestyle equals life fulfillment. And there's also been a caveat to that formula, which is in order to attain wealth and desired lifestyle, it's unavoidable and necessary to sacrifice integrity, people, and social responsibility. Now, there's nothing at all wrong with wealth accumulation, with pursuing a specific lifestyle. Those things are wonderful and they're lovely, but what natural developers have taught me is that those aren't the things that give them life fulfillment. In fact, some of the most successful people have sought out my help over the decades. People who have been successful by monetary standards, multimillionaires, people who have been successful in terms of being captains of industry, CEOs, or politicians who have huge amounts of influence. And they've sought me out because they've attained their wealth and lifestyle goals, and they still don't feel fulfilled.
They come up empty.
Right. And what natural developers have taught me is that the intersection of our three core drives, authenticity, connection, and impact, is the formula for true life fulfillment. And it's also the formula for integrity, because authenticity translates into self-integrity, connection translates into relationship integrity, and impact translates into societal integrity.
Okay.
So it's impossible to divorce life fulfillment and integrity, even though we've pretended that it is possible.
Okay, good.
So with the authenticity core drive,
Yes.
what that translates into in terms of integrity is that when I am true to my own passions, when I'm true to my own boundaries, and when I'm true to my own needs for self-care, then I'm in self-integrity. And as someone who is largely a do-gooder in the world, and I don't mean that term pejoratively, I'm largely a do-gooder in the world, I focus largely on the impact core drive that I have. I have a tendency as a do-gooder to be self-neglectful, to be having self-integrity deficits. Even though my societal integrity is very, very strong, I have a susceptibility to integrity deficits at the level of self-integrity.
Well, I have a feeling you're not alone in that.
I'm not. What I've found is that there are basically three groups of people. There are self-improvers who are more focused on their authenticity core drive than on their connection or impact core drives. There are connectors. There are people who are really relationship oriented, so they're focused more on their connection core drives than their authenticity or impact core drives. And there are the do-gooders who are more focused on having positive impact in the world, on their impact core drive, than on their authenticity.
And it's
or
more rare, is
drives.
what you're saying, to find someone that has a really good balance of those three.
It's really rare, in my experience, to
Yeah.
find people who have a good balance among the three. And that's partly because we haven't had a three-dimensional understanding of what creates life fulfillment and what creates integrity, nor have we understood that they're one and the same.
Okay. So getting back to authenticity and self-care, can you say more about that?
Sure. So the aspect of authenticity that has to do with self-care is that if we don't care for ourselves to a sufficient amount, a sufficient degree, then we aren't going to have the life energy we need in order to be who we truly are, in order to really sustain loving and collaborative connection with people, and to make the kind of difference in the world that we want to make.
Yeah.
So a lot of people equate self-care and self-indulgence, or self-care and selfishness. And in fact, the paradox is that proper self-care is the opposite of indulgence or self-centeredness.
Yes.
It is the antidote to self-absorption, because when we don't care for ourselves sufficiently, we don't have enough life energy for authenticity, connection, and impact.
Okay, good. Very interesting. So how do you manage that or how does a person keep that distinction alive in their daily life? In other words, distinguish between being selfish from caring for the basic needs in being authentic, being true to oneself. How do we keep that distinction alive?
The best way, the simplest way to keep that distinction alive is that if I or you or any of us feels depleted, tired, cranky, exhausted, irritable, less than fully present, not having the zest for life and passion for life that we want to have, we can be virtually 100% certain that some aspect of our self-care is suffering.
Okay, good. And so what are some of the best ways to go about restoring that?
Well, there are three dimensions to self-care. One is internal self-care, one is environmental self-care, and one is logistical self-care.
Okay.
Internal self-care is things that we would expect it to be, like eating well and making sure we move on a daily basis, exercise, and getting enough sleep. For starters, those are some examples of internal self-care.
Would you also include spirituality in that one?
Well, actually, I would, and I do, in that another aspect of self-care has to do with being able to enter internal silence. And internal silence is a rejuvenation method that in some circles is called meditation.
Yes.
In some circles is called mindfulness. In some circles is called prayer.
Yes.
So that's a very important part of internal self-care.
And some people might go their whole life neglecting that completely and not realize that creates a deficit in their self-care authenticity.
And in fact, I am one of those people who went for far too long a time with self-neglect because of dealing with a lot of crises that were unfolding in my life, in my personal life, during a 4-year period of time. And I believed, oh, well, I have good stamina, which I do. Yeah. And because I have good stamina, I can get away with kind of letting myself go and not attending to my self-care needs, not attending to my emotional needs, not attending to my relationship and nourishment kinds of needs. And I'll take care of those things later after the crises pass.
Yes.
And boy, was I wrong. I paid a gigantic price for that chronic self-neglect. I paid two prices. One was that my chronic self-neglect was a huge contributor to the divorce of my first marriage. And it was also a huge contributor to them having found a small colony of cancer cells in my prostate.
Wow.
All because I had the arrogance as a do-gooder in the world to think that if I'm doing good in the world, if I'm being in integrity with society, if I'm being in integrity with my relationship commitments, that that's all there is to integrity. And I was wrong.
Okay, excellent. So what's involved in recovering our integrity in the connection area of relationship integrity?
Well, relationship integrity is a combination of commitment competence, which means that I only commit to things that I'm really going to follow through on, and where I not just have good intentions, but I actually embody those good intentions. Really, good intentions don't count unless they're backed up with action that matches those intentions. And so commitment competence and accountability in those kinds of ways is a very important aspect of connection and our relationship integrity kind of drive. The other aspect of relationship integrity is a very overlooked one, which has to do with how in our society and literally around the world, we tend to over-rely on two of the three forms of problem solving that exist. The three forms of problem solving that exist, very briefly, are coercion, compromise, and synergy or collaboration. Coercion is where I make you do what I think is good for you. And compromise is where I have my position and you have your position, and somehow we
meet in the middle.
Meet in this sort of gray area middle. And the problem with, of course, with coercion is that the price of coercion is resentment. It's not a sustainable strategy for relationship building.
It's like whatever can't go on won't.
Exactly. And the problem with compromise, even though most of us are taught to worship the importance of compromise, is that the best obtainable outcome with a compromise strategy is that all parties walk away from the negotiating table feeling equally ripped off. And synergy or collaboration is where we peek underneath our respective positions or postures to identify the core intentions underneath them. So that we're able to identify what we're most hoping to achieve by the proposed solution that we've offered. And where we engage in dialogue about those core intentions rather than our postures about how to obtain those core intentions. And when we peel things away to that level, then all kinds of creative problem-solving strategies start to emerge that neither of us would have thought of on our own. That's what synergy is, and it is the cornerstone. Synergy is the cornerstone of relationship integrity.
And you're saying we're in kindergarten when it comes to synergy, as
the vast majority, as a species, the vast majority of us are still in kindergarten when synergy needs to be our first choice connection strategy. It ends up being the last choice that's used, if it's used at all.
If it's used at all, yeah. Which is why our world looks the way it does in terms of world conflicts and
that's right.
And suffering.
And that's why it's so important that leaders become really, really proficient in synergy facilitation. Any leader that's not proficient in that aspect of relationship integrity is going to be very disappointed with themselves as a leader and is going to find that the people that they lead are disappointed with them too.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much. Okay, and finally, how can we go about becoming whole and complete in the way in which we impact the world around us or the society in which we live in?
Well, we've already touched on one aspect of that, which is tied to relationship integrity, which is that capacity for synergy and that capacity for commitment competence. Building on that, what our impact core drive or our societal integrity motivation calls upon us to do is to recognize that I don't really get to be whole and complete if I think I'm an island that's separated from the world around me. That there is an important interaction between me and the world around me, and it's so deep that if I neglect that, I'm not going to feel whole. And I'm not going to feel whole because I'm not going to feel like I have impact on anyone, that I can make a positive difference. I'm going to fall into a state that in psychology is referred to as learned helplessness, where nothing I do makes a difference. And so impact integrity, societal integrity, is about reclaiming not just our right to have impact, not just our obligation to have impact, but even more importantly, our awareness that we don't get to be a whole and complete person if we don't have our particular ways of having positive influence in the world. And so the very wealthy and the very powerful end up being susceptible to operating in a bubble, being too isolated.
Yes.
And at the other end of things, people who feel like they have no impact are also in a bubble where they underestimate just how much they influence the world around them. I mean, the truth about leadership is that every single one of us is a leader, whether we want to be or not. Because even though there are many different forms of being a leader, the one universal form of leadership is called role modeling. We are always, every single one of us, always role modeling something. And if we're role modeling narcissism to someone else, self-centeredness, then we're saying to them, well, it's okay to be self-centered. If we go into a parking lot and we don't care about the way the parking spots are set up, and we park over the line, making the spot next to us unusable by someone else in a filled parking lot, we're saying to the next person, you know what? It doesn't matter that you don't care about me either. Go ahead and not care about me either. That's how we destroy societies, through underestimating just how much impact we actually have.
Yes. So in a sense, if these deficits were able to be transformed and healed, then we could imagine a much more equitable world, yes?
A much more loving world, a more equitable world, a more productive world, a wealthier world, a happier world, a world...
A kind of you and me world, as opposed to a you or me world.
And a world in which people who are passionate about generating wealth are free to generate wealth without sacrificing their integrity. And people who are passionate about making a difference in the world, regardless of how much wealth they generate, are free to do that and not be stepped on.
Okay, on that note, Dr. Gruder, how can our viewers get a hold of your book, The New IQ?
Well, they can order it through their bookstore locally if they don't have it in stock, or through Amazon.com or any of the online booksellers. If they go to www.thenewiq.com, they'll not only be able to read a lot more about the book, but they'll also learn about the accompanying workbook, which is only available from that website, as well as the Integrity Watch blog that they'll have access to, and the Integrity Stimulus Plan that I've made available to everyone.
Okay, perfect. Dr. David Gruder, thank you so much for having been our guest today. I've really enjoyed having you here today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure. You've been watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. You can find us on the internet at www.definingmoment.tv. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.